Okay, so hello. Today we're going to talk about our tile saw and setting up our tile saw. And for operational purposes, we're going to set it up right over here. And we have it stored in the backstock room. Remember, this is a piece of equipment for your instructors to use and set up and use with you. If you're a grad student or an advanced student who has been thoroughly checked out and approved by your faculty, you can go ahead and do this, but otherwise we expect that you grab one of us to help set up. But it is a super cool tool that we can do a lot of interesting stuff with. So follow me in the back here and I'll show you where it's located. Our tile saw lives way down here. And there's a couple of components that we need to grab with it. So one of which is this green bucket, could get a better label, tile saw, and that's got all of the gear that we need to operate this machine, as well as some splash guards back here. So once we've got the tile saw set up here, it's a pretty quick action to set it up. And this is what they call a job site tile saw. It's one of the higher end ones, which is really cool, but they typically are found on construction sites. So right here, we're going to want to step on that, and then we just slowly bring it back. And it'll, support its own weight. So I'm applying some force here, and then it's going to lock in place. Quick note about the saw. The condition that you see it in here is entirely unacceptable. If you use this saw, it needs to go back totally clean. This is actually really disappointing, so let's not do that. So inside our inside the tile saw box, we've got a lot of important stuff. So this is something, there's a little hook on the front door that we'll want to hang on the door when we're operating the tile saw. And this one, of course, that maybe is a backup one. We also have got a number of ear protections. So these are for students who may be in here mixing glazes or something. The tile saw does operate at a decibel that we want to have ear protection on while we're using it. And then we also have a couple of safety glasses. So instructors, you need to have ear protection on and eye protection, as well as any students who are operating the machine or standing by with you while you operate the machine. We have an extension cord, which is sometimes useful depending on the status of our outlets, if they're tied up with other stuff. And then we've got a couple of other attachments for the tile saw, depending on how you're making your cuts. These can be helpful to create angles, etc. So this little plastic extension pops onto our table here to support wider tiles, which is really helpful, obviously, if we're cutting some bigger things. It's also important to put this on. So we're looking at this is going to slot in here, and this one in here. These two are going to catch right underneath there. And what this does is prevents a lot of the water, because this is a wet saw, from spraying all over here. Just keeps the mess down a little bit. Lastly, we'll go ahead and plug this in, and then we'll go over the operation and startup procedures. So we can, unless somebody's using the spray booth, we can go ahead and unplug that and plug this in right here. So one of the awesome kind of key features about this is that it is a wet saw, so we get much cleaner cuts. So located behind here is a pump, a lot like a sort of garden fountain pump, and then this acts as a filter. And what we can see right here, this is our low water level, and imprinted on there it says add, and this is our max fill level. So we want to go ahead and use our wet bucket to fill this up, which will fill up the whole tray, and then we'll be able to start cutting. And again, folks, we should have this all cleaned out, sponged out. We don't want that residue staying in there and tearing up our pump. So you'll see we're past the minimum. We want to get, close enough to the max, but don't need to go over it. So as far as operation, there's a couple of different ways to approach using this saw. So we can have it set at a permanent depth, which you can see here would be below the level of the cut zone, by twisting this and setting the height of the saw. So it's locked in place, and then all we're doing is moving this. And that's usually one of the best ways to go about cutting. It's a little safer. It can lead to problems and other cracks, but it just depends on what you're cutting. The other option is to use it more like we might a saw in the wood shop, where we can come down and slowly cut through something, particularly if we're not trying to cut through all of it, etc. When we're working with tiles, something that's entirely flat, best practices is actually to do a scoring cut. So one that we just score the surface on and only go down about that much. And that way, if it does crack, it cracks on our cut. And then after that, we would set the depth a little bit deeper and then make another cut. But that's the best practices for tiles. Okay, so as we're getting ready to cut, it's important to note this switch here. If we activate the double side, that just turns on our pump, and it will be constantly on. And there's some times that we want to use this, but the vast majority of the time we want this switch toggled to the single line, which points to our on and off switch, which means that when we switch on the machine, the pump will automatically come on. Before we do our final cuts, we want to double check everything. The saw is in place. I've got it set to the, an appropriate depth. I'll go ahead and actually adjust that on this one so that we can just barely score this. Everything's plugged in. We've got water. Make sure the rest of the students in here have proper PPE on. And then we can go ahead and turn it on and cut. Practice our slide, make sure everything's working. There's nothing over here like this that's going to get in the way when we're cutting. So you'll note over here we have two different locking mechanisms. If we unlock this one, you can see that it'll slide, but we can't actually cut to the bitter end here. So if you're not cutting through something, that'll work. But the vast majority, and also it restricts our back movement to about here. So we can only do a 22-inch thing, and it stops right about here. So the vast majority of our projects, we're gonna wanna have both of these unlocked so that we get a full slide all the way through, and if we have larger things to come all the way back here. Okay, before we start our cut, we're just going to want to make sure everything's moving smoothly, make sure we can get all the way through, make sure the depth is correct, and then we also want to make sure that we don't have any obstacles in our way like that we're going to bump into and get distracted by during the cut. It's also important to make sure everybody's got ear protection that might be in the glaze lab, and then we can go ahead and cut. So we've got our switch set to the 1, and we can cut. And I'm going to adjust that depth so it goes a little bit deeper, which ensures that in case it did crack, it would crack along the lines that we want. Okay. A pretty good cut. Okay, so for some of the more advanced practices, when we're cutting things, if we're going to operate this more like a saw, it's important to hold this down. We're not getting our fingers close to this, etc. Follow all the other practices. It's also best to have a Sharpie line or something that you can follow. In this case, we're doing a demo, so we're just going to try and cut a little bit off and show you how that goes.